Our guest today is Jeffrey Schnapp. And Jeffrey is involved in too many things to mention all at once, but I will try mentioning a few. And as advertised, we are going to spend a lot of our time talking about the future of libraries in the digital age. But that conversation, I think, will likely expand a bit. Before moving to Harvard in 2011, Jeffrey Schnapp occupied the Periotti Chair of Italian Studies at Stanford, where he founded the Stanford Humanities Lab in 1999. His most recent books are the Electric Information Age book, Italo-America II, and Modern Italia, a collection of essays on 20th century Italian literature, design, and architecture, and Digital Humanities, a book co-written with Ann Burdick, Joanna Drucker, Peter Lunenfeld, and Ton Presner. Forthcoming with Harvard University Press in the spring of 2014 is The Library Beyond the Book, a book co-written with his MetaLab colleague Matthew Battles that explores future scenarios for libraries in the digital age. Other current or future projects are described under the In the Works tab of the website at MetaLab. Faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, he is professor of Romance languages and literature and also on the teaching faculty in the Department of Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He's the faculty director of MetaLab at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Schnapp.
Thank you, George, for the introduction. And as the introduction suggests, I am not an architect or a designer, but my work in some very fundamental ways is deeply engaged in processes of design. And what I'd like to do for purposes of our conversation today is to give you, whoops, I guess restart PowerPoint. I think that will be the point of departure here. I'm sorry. PowerPoint just crashed on us, George.
Oh, okay. Not to worry.
And I don't see it on your. Okay, I see it now. Okay, let's restart that. All right, there we go.
Good.
You want to swap for us? Let's see. I think it might be the presenter that's misbehaving here.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what.
Well, while we're solving this technical issue, what I want to just underscore is how the fundamental tasks of contemporary design practice, whether by design we understand the design of physical spaces, we understand product design, we understand the design of communications, the basic forms through which knowledge is conveyed in our society. These kinds of questions are questions that are extraordinarily broad, and while they often require specialized design competencies, there we go, of one kind or another, they also require in-depth knowledge, expertise, in a really wide range of fields. In my own field of origin is actually, I was trained as a medieval cultural historian. I started out working largely in manuscript culture in the 13th century, 14th centuries. Are we all set there?
Yeah, I'm afraid it seems to not want to go into the slideshow.
Oh, okay.
So, this is,
I can just use them.
is that right?
Hopefully it'll be legible all the same. Here, we'll just.
Sorry about that.
Oh, not a problem. I don't know. And over the course of my own career, my own interests, I was a faculty member at Stanford for 25 years and was involved in a series of ventures that were all really trying to really imagine what forms of historically based scholarship look like in the digital age. And in the process of imagining a world where the kind of model of scholarly communication, the way knowledge is produced and reproduced in our world is increasingly migrating not just to digital forms, but to all kinds of hybrid forms that involve legacies from the past, like print culture, which is completely in a sense, defined all the boundaries of the world of learning for over the course of the last 5-6 centuries to new and emerging hybrid forms. And I became increasingly involved in forms of experimentation with what a universe looks like, where we have this constant multi-channeling of knowledge forms, trying to think about problems like how we weave this vast quantity, these vast repositories of data that make up our world, make up our personal lives, the sort of data fields we carry with us. How do we weave them into the physical environment? How do we make them matter in ways that are significant? And at the core of really at the core of the kinds of questions that I've just been listing out is, in my view, a design proposition, a problem of design. Now, people like myself who have this hybrid identity between sort of areas of design practice and research on the one side and areas of cultural historical research and inquiry on the other are sometimes referred to as digital humanists. Digital humanities is a very broad umbrella phrase that has been used to describe emerging areas of experimental scholarship that work at the boundary line between physical collections and digital tools, repositories, platforms, and so forth. I'm not, like many people, not terribly fond of digital humanities as a label. I have often played with the notion of calling what I do instead knowledge design for reasons that I hope will become clear to you. The big question that interests me as a scholar and a design practitioner is really this question of what knowledge looks like in the digital age. Up until certainly throughout even the 20th century, the answer to that question was self-evident. Knowledge looks like print. Our basic assumptions of how an argument is made, how evidence is presented, how cultural form conveys itself to the world was closely connected to the technology of print. As we have moved into a world where print coexists with a whole range of other options, the question of what knowledge looks like becomes a fundamental question. The role, for instance, that forms of visual argument have taken, the use of media-based forms of argument, all of these are reshaping our basic assumptions about what it is to communicate, to engage in forms of social interaction, to share research results, to make arguments, and so on. And even though this is a little bit blurry, some of the issues that interest me in particular, and since the time that I founded the Stanford Humanities Lab in 1999, then I moved to Harvard in 2009, and I now run a structure called MetaLab at Harvard, which is we're under the umbrella of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, but we're housed at the Graduate School of Design. So we live in this space between, in a sense, a very distinguished policy research and research institute, namely the Berkman Center, associated with, for instance, the rise of Creative Commons. And the Berkman Center has played a predominant role in this area of trying to define network culture, define the rule sets that govern network culture, to shape the kind of public space that it represents. And on the other hand, design, areas of design practice, whether it's the design of space, whether it's the design of communications forms, whether it's even the design of specific artifacts. So some of the areas that have defined my version of digital humanities, at least, what I like to call knowledge design, are certainly an interest in new models of collaborative-based work, of teamwork, or so-called co-creation. Second of all, and I think this is a larger design challenge for thinking about the way that we use media and the way that print intersects, for instance, with digital media in our age. And that is moving away from this sort of product orientation that has shaped so many areas of culture and life that print was certainly a powerful vector for. A print object, when it is printed, it lives in a kind of final state. I've written probably too many books over the course of my career, and I can tell you it's a very strange experience as a scholar. You maybe will experience this if you write a thesis, for instance. You spend months, years, sometimes even decades, working in relative solitude, interacting with a very small number of people, A manuscript is finally sent off to a publisher. Another year passes while it's being read, discussed, eventually maybe accepted, edited, and so forth. And then after all those years have gone by, a book appears, and suddenly it's out in the world. And if you have made subsequent discoveries about some piece of the argument, if you have changed your mind, there's very little you can do except engage in self-criticism, I suppose. That very slow pipeline has completely collapsed. It's been telescoped. And almost everything we do today that involves forms of design practice as well as knowledge is being iteratively shared. We've moved into a world where process is the product, in a sense. But what does that mean? How do we make process a rich product, one that we can engage with, one we can cite to make arguments? Those are the kinds of issues that have interested me in particular. Visualization, the rise of visualization tools as ways of telling stories, but also the rise of visualization tools as a kind of rhetoric, as a persuasive toolkit for all kinds of areas of life in the digital era, in the realm of network culture. A domain that particularly interests me, and it'll come up in the later slides that I'm going to show you, is this issue of what we can now study, capture, preserve, archive in the world today that was largely left out of the historical record. If you think about, for instance, the fact that the entire history of human, the whole record of whether it's music, voice, the whole dimension of sound in human culture has completely disappeared up until the arrival of recording technologies in the 20th century. We know, for instance, that medieval culture, like many cultures today, were predominantly sound-based cultures, that many fundamental forms of social interaction were built around music, live performance, and so forth. None of that record is preserved. Suddenly, in the course of the 20th century, we've entered a world, and now ever more acutely so, where those cultural forms can not just be preserved, they can actually be analyzed, studied, the way that we study texts. They can be essentially studied down to the smallest, most fine-grained forms of interaction, dissected. Sound files can be annotated the way that we once only could annotate textual artifacts. That's an interesting world for a cultural historian. It's also an interesting world for somebody engaged in creative practice or artistic practice. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a couple of other points I want to make. I mentioned the centrality of design. When you move from a world where the printed page is the gold standard, it is the only sort of measure of the currency, if you like, of knowledge, to a world where the printed page interacts with so many other forms, and iteratively, constantly, without that sense of finality, of like arriving at the product, you enter into a world where design becomes fundamental, where every research question has to be thought of, not just in terms of a series of containers that have already been fully designed and exist, but the container itself has to be part of the design. And that is the world that I think design, knowledge design works in. And that includes also thinking about what I referred to before as multi-channeling. Like, how does a print artifact intersect with a website and a series of participatory components where the contents may change from one day to the next? Thinking critically about the interaction between different media, I think, is part of that design process. And last but not least, the work that I do, as I think I'll be able to show you rather clearly, especially in the final sort of set of slides I'm going to show you, is very much focused on the question of public knowledge. I'm very interested in not so much the digital per se. I'm not a programmer, although I do all kinds of programming-based work. But what I'm really interested in is the kind of public space that the network culture can open up, the way in which we can create new audiences for culture and knowledge. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to move forward here to talk really about 4 broad areas that shape my own practice. George mentioned specifically the interest in libraries. And I'm going to talk not in very fine detail, but just in general about an endeavor that's been going on for the last essentially 2 years at Harvard that I have been leading, which has 2 names. It originally started as biblioteca, or the Latin word for library, the Greek word actually for library, and it has sort of transmuted itself into an ongoing design studio that's called Library Test Kitchen. I'm going to show you some of the dishes we've been cooking up in the test kitchen. The focus of Library Test Kitchen is really, and in fact the ambition of Library Test Kitchen right from the beginning was to create a kind of space of conversation between professional librarians, between people in the design and architecture community, and between different communities of users about the future of library spaces. And I hope to convince you that libraries are kind of crystallize all of the core, the most exciting design challenges that we face in the present. The second area I'm going to talk about briefly is the question of data, of how the ubiquity of large amounts of data could be leveraged through innovative, creative, design-based approaches and made significant for human society and culture. Particularly, I'll say something about 2 projects that MetaLab has underway right now. Library Observatory, which is an attempt to create a toolkit for using the Digital Public Library of America, and Corium.com, which is a project that's barely in progress. We just really started up. We're about to launch it sometime this fall, which is about collections, about leveraging the tremendous power of museum and other kinds of collections and letting people do things with them, not just storing them or retrieving, creating, basically conventional means of access and discovery. The third area that I'm interested in, this might seem paradoxical for somebody who's sometimes referred to as a digital humanist, I'm really interested in print. Like, how do we remediate, reimagine print in an environment that's so rich with possibilities like our own? I'm going to show you some examples, some experiments with trying to reimagine what a scholarly book might look like today. Some of them are completed experiments, some of them are work in progress. And the fourth area, the final area, has to do with 2 related issues in my view. One, I've been involved in a number of projects that have tried to reimagine existing but abandoned pieces of the industrial infrastructure and to reinvent them as cultural institutions, as a kind of experimental history museum in the case of one of them. In the case of the other, it's a project to transform a submarine base into another kind of history space. But these are spaces that raise some interesting questions about how institutions like museums or archives or libraries, for that matter, might reinvent themselves and also reinsert themselves into the fabric of cities. So those are the 4 broad areas that I want to talk about, and we can come back to these in the course of the conversation. So I want to start with libraries. This was in the fall of 2000, or actually it was in the spring of 2011, a major project was launched at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which goes under the title of the Digital Public Library of America. The Digital Public Library of America was an attempt akin to Europeana, which is the European Union project that's analogous to it, and a number of other attempts to take all of those growing, rapidly growing digital repositories that are being created by libraries throughout the world, in this case, throughout the United States, throughout North America, and to somehow make them accessible through a single portal. So the interesting question is, what does a digital public library look like? We all know what a public library looks like, the Carnegie Libraries, Boston Public, one of the great public libraries. We have a sort of image architecturally, we have a certain set of assumptions about what this physical space of a library is. But in the case of a digital public library, The main models that we have are rather, I would say, rather impoverished models. They basically involve systems of access to electronic documents. And the mere fact of access is only the beginning of the many, many possibilities that such libraries involve. At the same time, the Harvard University as a whole was undergoing a public debate because of the economic situation. There was a lot of pressure to reorganize the library system, and Harvard has 73 separate libraries, and those 73 libraries have very different traditions. Some of them have different classification systems. They don't communicate necessarily well, not because some kind of devilish person didn't want them to communicate, but simply because they have different histories. They've served different populations. Some of those libraries are made up of seeds. Some of those libraries are made up of archival documents. Some of those libraries are made up of books and objects together. So it seemed like a really interesting moment to bring together those two conversations. And within the setting of a larger debate that's going on within our society about what a library should be or could be. Do we need public libraries anymore? I'm sure all of you have heard of echoes of these kinds of debates. Is the library an institution that has been superseded by Google Books or by the many repositories that are available to you on your smartphone? I think the answer is no to all of those questions. But the idea was to create a space that would allow for critically engaged and historically informed conversation about this question, but in the context of an architecture school, in the context of a design studio, in the context that involves a kind of propositional component that would answer these sorts of questions. What form should the library of the 21st century assume? Should it vanish into the screen on your laptop, or is there something distinctive about the library as a space that we want to preserve, that's essential to the to knowledge sharing, to teaching, to any range of social and civic functions? And the idea here was really to create a design space, in part because the library professional community is brilliant at doing, in a sense, the job that it was trained to do. But when it comes to playful thinking about what a library could be or might be, that's not what librarians were typically trained to do. Librarians were trained to serve communities of users in particular ways. So our sense was there was a real need for a space that would allow for this kind of thinking. And I'm just going to show you really quickly some of the work that students did in this class, because it gives you a kind of flavor for the kind of design conversation that we tried to create. So one of the projects, so this is a project that was exploring a speculative scenario, which is, what if books could talk to you? Most of the libraries that we work with are circulating libraries where you can take a book out. So the reality of a library today, a library in a university environment, is that that collection doesn't sit in storage units, but rather it moves around the community. So what if each time that you had searched for a book, it remembers you, so that when you're in its physical proximity, it sends you a text message, or it says, I'm here, come have a look now. This was one of those kinds of scenarios. Or what if, now that the norm in the world that we live in is that everything is a hotspot? Some of you may recall we used to talk about, oh, there's a hotspot. You could actually get wireless access over there. Well, now wireless access is so ubiquitous. The real question is, how do we design cold spots? Like, how would you engineer places that are off the grid? How would you engineer them also in the sense of, do you want to have a world where there's no Wi-Fi, or do you want to filter certain, like, do you not want social media in a corner of a library space? Do you want to, in other words, switch off, toggle on and off different components? This was another project that was undertaken, the cold spot. Or what did the basic furnishings of a library look like? What would be a carrel in the 21st century? Could a carrel, for instance, become a kind of curation station where the sort of work that goes on, the work of gathering together material, is visible to a community, so that you can share, in a sense, the knowledge-making process, the knowledge-collecting process? I don't know if any of you walk around sometimes in the stacks of a library and look at what people have collected on their desktops. Sometimes that's the most interesting place. It's long before somebody has written something. You kind of see what they're working on. Or what does a reference desk look like in a world of ubiquitous mobile devices? Or how might we take traditional library architectures and insert modules that would allow for differential uses? Or how might we take the stacks out into the street, make the sense of the library, this world that's filled with information, physically palpable? And all of this eventually translated into Library Test Kitchen. And this was the poster for Library Test Kitchen. If you've been to the Boston Public Library, you recognize this is the great reading room. This was the poster that was a deliberate invitation to students involved. These were mostly design and architecture students, also some students from the School of Public Health and some students from the Arts and Sciences faculty, to really play with the idea of how you would reimagine or reinvent a library space. And this has become now an ongoing design studio. It's in its third semester right now. You can go and look online at some of the projects that are underway. We ran an experiment called the Library. It was a pop-up library on Mount Auburn Street last year. There's a series of examples of student work that's taken place over the course of these 3 semesters. But the core issue that I want to kind of focus in on is what I think is really the core design issue that is of interest, certainly to me and the community that I belong to, and that is there's a lot of talk in the culture that we live in about smart space, about the weaving together, if you like, of data and space. But there are very few rich models of how you do that well. Think about what rooms with workstations look like in libraries, not to mention in other kinds of academic buildings. How well designed are those spaces? Those are generally pretty terrible spaces, in my view. They're pretty deadly. The workstations arrive as an afterthought. What does a good space like that look like? Well, libraries are the most extreme expression of this problem. Libraries are all about the preservation of information and then the sharing of information. So how do we design smart spaces that are really smart, not just sort of afterthoughts? The library crystallizes all of those tensions. And the kind of things that have been undertaken in this context include, for instance, thinking about how basic devices like scanners and copying machines, these devices that are part of library environments, how can we make them more interesting? Like, let's say we did an experiment for the library where every time you take a book to be scanned, you have to scan the barcode, and once you scan the barcode, you see the whole social history of that book. Like who read it before, not by name, obviously, without violating privacy, but like how the book is circulated, what its history was. Those are the kinds of opportunities that I think are interesting. So I mentioned the question of data. And Library Observatory and Corium are 2 examples of attempts to try to imagine a world where we can actually, with the cognitive powers that we have as humans, interact with really large assemblies of stuff. Like, if you ever walk the stacks of a library, of course, you have this very rich but also intimidating experience of being surrounded by just like vast amounts of printed culture, corridor after corridor. When you do that and you're experiencing the analog to that on a screen, what typically you see is long lists of stuff. There is not very much you can do with long lists of stuff. If you ever do a Google search where you come up with hundreds of pages of stuff, you know what you can do. You can spend endless hours going page by page by page looking at the stuff. It's not very interesting, and it's generally not very useful. So let's take the Digital Public Library of America. What if your collection is in the millions, maybe the tens of millions of objects that you're searching with? How do we create an experience that allows you to do stuff with that, to make it meaningful? So we've been, at MetaLab, we've built a series of prototypes for the Digital Public Library of America using different kinds of visualization strategies. I'll show you one in a while, that try to make that experience a meaningful experience, an experience that allows you to see stuff about collections, to use visualization tools, to look at aggregates that even the librarians, even the museums that own collections can't see, because you can't see 50,000 objects at once. But you can use visualization tools and powerful database tools to make that an experience. And that's an interesting experience. It gives you a set of possibilities that are navigational, that are storytelling-based, that are expressive. And within this context, we started a project that, as I mentioned, is underway right now. The platform is called Corium. It's a collection of collections. It's a platform. But the collection that it's focused on is a photographic collection that's an archive of Italian Renaissance art objects, 17,000 photographs of Italian Renaissance art objects that are lost. So we have photographs. We know they existed at one point in time. How do we find them? How do we track them down? How do we see their relationship to works that may be on the walls of museums today? Well, there will never be a universe of funding where a group of professional curators can sit down and try to solve these sorts of puzzles. So we're interested in leveraging the power of teachers, communities of students, communities of collectors, people who just are fascinated by puzzles. And Corium is essentially a platform that allows institutions that hold collections, whether they're photographic collections or they're collections of any kind, to put the data sets into a form that allows you not only to use these navigational and visualization tools to access them and to see where the objects are distributed, to ask questions about them. How are they distributed temporally? What are the materials that make them up? To zoom in on a little piece and pull out details, even down to the individual object, even down to fragments of that object. And then to do things with them, to tell stories, to see relationships, to annotate them, maybe to identify them, maybe to puzzle over some aspect of the shift. And these are just wireframes of how this system works. But as you can see, as in this sort of animated version, you're moving from very big entities to a series of tools that allow you to see a map of those objects, to then zoom in, see a smaller slice, see sets of interrelations, and then to pull those out and construct meanings. The meanings that mean something to the community to which you involve. That kind of design work is the kind of design work that interests me a great deal because I think at the core of it, it's the place where we make the richness of just the data fields that surround us, whether it's in our personal lives or at the level of institutions, actually matter, actually circulate and mean something in society. I mentioned my interest in print, and I've been involved in a series of experiments. This one is one of the more recent ones, of trying to really reimagine how we could turn forms of print-based communications into a lively sort of medium. And I'm just going to really go through this quickly. This is an experiment where you can see that playing with a series, a kind of a typology of books that were essentially experimental paperbacks from the period of the late 60s, early 70s. The medium is the Massage. The McLuhan, Quentin Fiore book is the most famous one. With my collaborator, Adam Michaels, we have been working essentially on trying to not imitate those books, but play with the conventions that people were trying to develop back already in the late 60s, the first cybernetic era, trying to reimagine what a book looks like in an era when, for instance, a live medium like television was taking over and transforming the conditions of communication. And we're about to present a kind of extended version of this book at the New York Art Book Fair this coming weekend. And Digital Humanities, Digital_Humanities is a similar book. You can see from these page layouts that it's a book that tries to experiment with what a book can do that's different, maybe that has different material attributes than a kind of conventional scholarly book. And similarly, a series that I've launched at Harvard University Press called the MetaLab Project series. This is the book, the library beyond the book that George was kind enough, just showing you how playing with different kinds of page conventions, we're really trying to create a new kind of scholarly book that would be fun, sexy. You can read fast, you could read slow, that will allow for a different model of reading. I'm going to stop here with just to briefly allude to two areas of two ongoing experiments, really, with recycled, repurposed architecture. The first is the Trento Tunnels project, about which you can find out more online, which is now in its fourth edition, actually, as we speak. And the second is a project for redeveloping the submarine base in Giri Epanormis in Albania. They're all projects that involve very complex physical sites that work with ruins of the industrial era, ruins of the Cold War. They try to transform them and to make them into socially engaging spaces. And they're both focused really on reinventing probably the most stagnant, the most sclerotic of the museum types that we have in our time, which are history museums. History museums are often incredibly object and document rich, but they're very poor experientially. So what does a history museum look like in a site where, for instance, as is the case here, it's very different. This is the original site of the Trento tunnels. As you can see, this is not a site where you can exhibit historical objects. It's too humid. These are two tunnels that go through a cliff. So how could we reimagine some of these kinds of institutions for our own era? And as I said, there have been 3 editions, and we're out of time here, so I'm not going to stop here, but I'm just going to take you on a kind of really quick guided tour through this experiment, which is an ongoing experiment. If you go to the northern Italian city of Trent, you can visit it. This was the first edition, an exhibition on World War I that uses the tunnels as a kind of phantasmagoric space, an immersive space. These are all archival documents that have been reworked to create an experience as much as a historical itinerary. 2 tunnels, one black, one white. The black tunnel dedicated to this phantasmagoric experience of the years of World War I, 1914 to 1918. The white tunnel dedicated to the way in which historical memories were constructed in the post-war period using this series of provisional structures that were built into the galleries. Then the second iteration, an exhibition that's like a kind of book. The pages of the book essentially are an alphabet, a kind of encyclopedia of the history of the region, using video, interacting with lighting effects, a whole series of other efforts, and then a history of Nordic skiing in 2 tunnels. It's a kind of interesting challenge to create an experience of outdoor sports in this space that really literally cuts under a mountain. And then finally, the Albanian project, which I'm not going to detail, but has many of the same challenges. What do we do with this enormous amount of over-construction that characterized the Cold War era? Trenches, bunkers, rocket housing structures. These are attempts, this is a problem throughout the world, and these are attempts to really imaginatively engage with these kinds of spaces in ways that attend to the physicality of these sites, but that also think about the way we can make them objects of experience for people who maybe never even visit those sites, where their true facade, if you like, opens out into the world of the World Wide Web, even as the design work is intensively concerned with bringing out the sort of physicality of a tunnel, of an underground site, and the like. I'm going to stop there.
Well, that is fantastic stuff. I'm delighted that you're here. I think I will try to get us started with a discussion about libraries, because it is, for reasons that we started to chat about before your talk, the intersection for you guys, for the students here, of the library in the town they grew up in with the library that they came to at Northeastern, which is like being remade every year, every 6 months, because we're kind of desperately concerned that that we be able to engage the digital age meaningfully in higher education. And I think there are very few people that don't engage with the library issue one way or another. I saw a great piece, you maybe saw it as well, I think it was in the Atlantic magazine, and it was written about the famous new Seattle Public Library, which is really famous for those of us in architecture, by an architect named Rem Koolhaas, and maybe known to some of you. It's a dramatic new library built 6 or 8 years ago. And I remember the head librarian and the chief advocate for this project had to assure the citizens of Seattle again and again and again, don't worry, This is not just going to be a place where homeless people hang out. I said, well, we're worried. And she said, don't worry, this is going to be a whole new enterprise. And it is. It's a whole new enterprise. It is also a whole new enterprise where homeless people hang out. But anyway, the point is that the roles that libraries play are so myriad. I wonder, let's just sort of talk a little bit about, let's say, the roles they play now, maybe the roles they played in Andrew Carnegie's time.
Yeah.
What role, you're in this a lot, what roles do you see libraries playing in public right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a profound question because we tend to have this sort of slightly mythological sense of the identity of libraries architecturally, as well as a slightly mythological sense of what those roles are. And I think the answer to the question is that I think libraries, in my view, the libraries have always had multiple roles. And within the world of libraries, there is such a high degree of heterogeneity, even though we tend to assume a certain core homogeneity, that the answer to the question really depends on who you are and where you are. So I think when we think about a public library, or a branch public library especially, the typical case, those are institutions that, whose roles have always been deeply civic in some kind of deep way. And I think that's increased rather than decreased over the course of the last 100 years. I think it would have been hard for Andrew Carnegie to imagine the way in which other kinds of civic institutions and spaces have been gradually eroded or eliminated in so many parts, let's say, of the United States, not to mention the rest of the world. The only public space in a lot of American communities is the mall, and it's not a public space, it's a private space.
Sure.
So I think that the branch public library has increasingly become one of the key civic locations, especially in those kinds of environments. And when we look at the statistical data on why people actually go to those kinds of libraries, it's fascinating because it's not the story that most librarians, even local librarians, would have told. The librarians naturally, quite correctly, assumed that people were coming to get access to information, typically books, right? Often the dominant reason for, especially in rural environments, for people to go to their local public library is broadband access in places where broadband access is not widely available, employment, whether it's through their access to broadband or access to different kinds of print media. So seeking employment, all kinds of government-related information, permits, taxes, in other words, very basic, practical civic functions. So if we start there and then we move to the absolute other end of the spectrum, sort of New York Public Library or the great research libraries that we find in universities, their identity is really a profoundly different identity. They have a very different set of, it seems to me, functions. I think the number of people seeking employment or voter information or broadband access is probably much, much smaller as a percentage. And they're curating information, delivering it in ways that are meaningful, providing context, social spaces, reading spaces, other kinds of spaces for activating knowledge becomes an absolutely crucial aspect. So, I mean, I guess what I would say, what we have seen is, to whatever degree there was one library, sort of one image, one true identity for the modern library, maybe sometime in the 19th century, to whatever degree that was true, we've moved gradually over the course of 2+ centuries, especially as we get closer to the present, into a world where we have libraries that have fundamentally different missions, very different identities. And I think that plural is about to become even more plural in the sense that the emerging models of libraries without books, libraries with only books, libraries that are basically a combination of maker spaces and learning spaces, in other words, where the hands are connected to the eyes and the brain. I think we're going to see a continuing multiplication of typologies, which raises some interesting questions for designers and architects, obviously. Like, what if you had to build a library today, what would it look like? Librarians can give you a vision that's anchored in the past, but who can read the tea leaves with regard to the future, especially in a world where we're seeing such a multiplication of ideas about what you can do or what libraries should do or what can they only libraries do.
Right, right, right. Well, you know, it's interesting because when I think about the timelines for these things, you know, it's if you go back to, you know, the libraries of people like the Emperor Hadrian, who, you know, and then actually the difference between the library of the Emperor Hadrian, who had his Latin and his Greek library, why? Because he'd conquered the known world and he needed to know what was going on, and but the difference between that time in the 1st century A.D. and Thomas Jefferson, who gave birth to the Library of Congress in the United States, it was really about how limited access to knowledge and information was. So, like that, really, there was hardly any change, Gutenberg or no, there was hardly any change between the 1st century A.D. and, you know, the early 19th century. At least, you know, I mean, obviously there were libraries in Europe, but in terms of access to information, it was still highly guarded. And all the ones in Europe, they were very limited access libraries. So the revolution that was Andrew Carnegie, and, you know, for those of you who don't know, those of you who might not be aware, Andrew Carnegie, the creator of U.S. Steel, one of the greatest you know, fortunes of the Gilded Age in late 19th century America, after he came over from Scotland and after he built U.S. Steel ruthlessly to be an incredibly valuable company, he then sold it all to J.P. Morgan and went about spending the rest of his life distributing some $400 to $500 million in circa $1,900, virtually all, to the end of creating a whole patchwork of libraries, of local libraries, precisely for an ideological purpose, which was that if the working man could get access to knowledge, he or she could advance him or herself in the way that Andrew Carnegie wanted people to advance themselves, that is, with as little help as possible. And so it became a very it seems to me a very ideological and effective tool for, let's say, telling an American story. Now, that is a narrative. I mean, maybe it's unreasonable to expect any contemporary reimagining of the library to have that kind of big picture, you know, Daniel Burnham style effect. But I wonder, as you disaggregate the pieces of the modern library, as you're talking about, you know, I mean, you and I probably both know a lot of people who have indeed taken on the very challenge that you are describing, building regional or local libraries, local branch libraries. There are several have recently been built in Boston. And the program is really shockingly different. I mean, even if the need for civic edifice is the same, the program is wildly different. I mean, you're quite familiar, for example, with the Cambridge Public Library.
Absolutely, yeah.
10 years in the making.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is an exemplary building. I think it's a building by Bill Ron and Associates, and they were struggling with all of these issues that we're talking about. And I've been in many conversations with groups of architects who are thinking about redesigning existing library spaces, designing new libraries, and I would say the solution that seems to be emerging increasingly is build a big box that's empty and make it modular and flexible, which is sort of like punting, of course. But I think you know, these are very rich questions, and they really cut to the core of this long story that you were evoking, George, of, you know, which is a great story, which is a story of democratization of access. You know, the princely libraries of the Renaissance were not that different from the princely libraries of the Roman Empire. They were places of access to a priesthood and to a very limited public. And the public library movement, it was a kind of triumphal march in the direction of access and democratization. And so the question of what the state, how that narrative is continued or not, I think is a very fundamental question for our civilization. You know, and the rise of digital libraries, of course, seems to be a continuation of that story. One could very much, I think, fairly argue that the kinds of repositories like Google Books, whatever their weaknesses are, and they have very significant weaknesses as libraries, which a professional librarian would be happy to hold forth on. But you now have on your smartphone or on your laptop a library that is exponentially bigger than the greatest libraries that were available, with very few exceptions, only a century ago. Everybody has that access who has access to a device and network. Now, the question of that broader mission of building a community of knowledge, the social functions of the library, all those other functions are still left there as a big question mark, because what kind of library is a digital public library? What kind of place is it? Well, it's a very impoverished place when you look at the richness of forms of social interaction, the way that people experience, work with, transform, interpret culture, information, knowledge. And that's where the question of how you design a library space, I think, starts to become extremely interesting.
You know, I can't help but be mindful of what this current exploration of the idea of libraries reveals about the kind of incoherence of our notions about them in the first place. We have very romantic ideas about libraries, I think. I mean, for example, Carnegie's view was really not a collective view at all. It was not a socialization view. It was about individual access. And yet it was behind a kind of civic edifice. It's really kind of interesting. You know, you wonder, should it have had a series of separate doors rather than a grand one? So as you could go into your carrel and read about how I'm going to beat you in the hardware game, or learn how to save money, or do those sorts of things. Certainly the program today for libraries, it seems to me, is one that is attempting to create a collective space. It's just not clear what we are planning to do in that collective space, whether it's our own library, which I think is very exciting and interesting, but filled with rooms that are, you know, one hopes someone is collaborating in. You know what I mean? Or clever individual kinds of furnishings, which allow you, they're kind of like a better workstation. But still, it seems that we are not actually, it still seems, and maybe the expectations are too high, because something like the Carnegie Library is such a comprehensive cultural operation. Maybe we are simply expecting that they slay too many dragons, and that maybe it's really more like well, we used to have phone booths, now we don't. Then we had fire call boxes, now we don't. You know, stop crying and let's move on, and we've got other things to do here. I mean, it might be that, you know, and I think this example in Seattle, this essay is just hilarious, by the way, because if you take all this stuff seriously, as I do, this very informed person is describing this kind of frankly sort of gold-plated debacle, which is an effort to reclaim a new, reclaim a lost civic identity, and it's kind of not really doing anything very different. I mean,
what I would say is that it's always been, the library has been a kind of key space of experimentation socially, going back even to the era of Carnegie. I don't know if you know this, but the very first Carnegie Library, all of you have seen a Carnegie Library, even if you didn't recognize it immediately. It always has, as George was hinting, a kind of colonnade at the front. It's a temple. It's sometimes a very modest temple, but a temple. There's a grand entrance, a little hall. There's certain basic equipment, the stack system around the periphery, a reference desk, a reading room. There's a kind of sort of basic set of elements. But when Carnegie, and as was being alluded to, Carnegie had this kind of individualist ethos behind his enterprise. He thought, give the worker access to basic information and knowledge. Let ordinary citizens educate themselves,
That's right.
empower themselves, and they will not need a kind of social state to support them. Right. When Carnegie started this, actually in the very first library that he built in Pennsylvania, that library had a gym and a swimming pool. So when he was imagining this world of self-empowerment, he was actually, and the architects and designers that and even the librarians he was talking to, they were trying to do something really visionary, and they were trying to imagine a model of the library that in a sense harkened back to ancient Greek gymnasia, which had a physical education sort of site, a gym, as part of the place where people who are engaged in physical exertion would exert their minds. And the idea of mind and body being, of course, conjoined in the process of one's self-empowerment appealed a lot to Andrew Carnegie, after all, who wanted to staff his offices at U.S. Steel. And I think that's a model of the library that gets stripped away. And early in the history, it's decided, no, that's too much like the YMCA, or it's too much...
Which is a great model, by the way.
Which is an interesting model.
YMCA is a fabulous model.
Yeah, a very interesting model. YMCA has always had libraries as well. So I think the library has always been a kind of architectural type in progress. But our myth has very much settled on this sort of one iteration, which is really basically focused on a few spaces of activation. A reading room, maybe a couple of reading rooms, a reference desk, a circulation desk, and then storage, a stack system. And that's the modern answer to the question of what is a library. But there were many other answers that circulate through the history of library design, really even going back to antiquity. And what really has been transformative, I think, in that story is this issue of access and scale. Because already in the 19th century, we start to see libraries that are just so vastly greater in size, like the British Library or like the Library of Congress, than any library that had ever existed before then. That suddenly the basic question of what the balance between those spaces are, what the balance between these different functions are, becomes much more complex. And I think we're, in a sense, still inside that question right now, but with an additional challenge, which is, what do we do in a world where we have not only this vast proliferation of documents that are being produced in digital form, where many of the key assets in the world of learning and knowledge are in the form of vast databases, and therefore information that can be accessed essentially through any network device. But print has not gone away, number one. We're printing more documents and more books today than we were ever printing in the history of humankind. And many of those knowledge forms that have migrated into the digital form have not gone away from print. So we have another issue, which is redundancy, vast degrees of redundancy. As we move into this more process-based, more iterative model of how things are published and shared, with versions changing all the time, there's also print elements in that mix. So in a sense, one of the things the library has to confront as a physical space, let's say we're talking about the Northeastern Library or one of the Harvard libraries, is how do we help that experience to make that a productive experience, not an experience of just confusion. It's like, what do I cite? That paper version or the 15 versions that are circulating on the web. So how do we design spaces for that? And that's a new question, I think. Vis-a-vis this history that we were evoking.
This is great. You're heading in a great direction on this, I think, because one of the things we're doing in this course is we are, as I told you, we're talking to people who design all kinds of things that are very broadly defined. I mean, our last guest was a restaurateur and entrepreneur. The one before that was an automobile designer of great renown, and we've got all kinds of other people. But one of the things that is in common, and what actually these folks are writing about and submitting no later than 5 p.m. today, he said, as a gentle aside, is some sort of key words that tie these things together, iteration and context, visualization, metrics, but also question. What is, in fact, and we were talking about this on the way over, is there anything more important, and I think this discussion of libraries perhaps reveals this to be true. Is there anything more important than zooming out and making sure you're asking the right question. And you've identified there are two, at least, there are more than two, but for the purposes of this discussion, two meaningfully different problems that you are attempting to solve, or that we are attempting to solve, or questions that we're attempting to answer. One of them having to do with, let's say, as you were alluding to, permanence and citability, and a kind of new taxonomy or organization for how knowledge gets processed and worked with, used. Another, a very different thing, is the vestigial cultural memory of whether it's the Carnegie Library, whether it's Thomas Jefferson's personal library becoming the Library of Congress, whether it's Le Broust's incredible libraries in Paris, whether it's a modest, modernist branch library from the 60s, or whether it's one that's being done today. What is the cultural, sort of physical, civic task? Well, those, it seems to me, just in asking this question, those are sufficiently different problems that they simply need to get dealt with differently. And if they happen to overlap in a place or with people, that'll be interesting. But those are two very different things. It's like saying, I need to design an Italian motorcycle on the one hand, and I need a minivan on the other.
Right.
And they're different things.
Yeah, and I think it's so easy for us to think, just because there has been an institution that once had a kind of cultural, social, economic meaning, that somehow managed those two tasks simultaneously, to think that those tasks are, naturally
inherently related,
inherently the same task.
Right.
And I think we're seeing some really interesting experiments happening today around this problem of reconciling those two identities that you just nicely, I think, specified. One model, which is a model some of you may have heard about if you follow these kinds of conversations at all, is the idea store model, which is being put into practice in London in particular. There's a series of these that have been very successful. And they've tried to reinvent a public library. These are branch public libraries, but well-funded branch public libraries. They're quite ambitious. But the focus has been very much on trying to think of how does this building not just become a kind of monument, but become the main square, like be that civic space, intersect with markets. They're actually, 2 out of the 4 of them are built in open marketplaces. Like these are food markets. You don't usually think of food as being in a friendly relationship to a library space, because librarians have taught us not to bring our coffee and food with us usually into the stacks, right? So the idea stores are interesting because, as I think the name already suggests, the store, right? The idea store. So this is a store that is somehow continuous with the culture of the market, but it's a place of ideas. But ideas manifest themselves in the physical realm. Books, documents, things we do around ideas, social activities, and so forth, performances. So the idea store would be one version, and that's a version that I think really is focusing on this role that certain spaces within the traditional library have always played, which are the activation spaces. Even Carnegie libraries had a little exhibition space. The idea that there would be this social space in the hall, right, when you walk in. Sometimes reading rooms have played those roles, and sometimes seminar rooms or other kinds of rooms. The deep storage piece of the identity of a library raises a whole other set of issues, clearly. And those issues are here with a vengeance when we're talking about knowledge that has this sort of redundancy that I was alluding to before, where you have print, but you can't collect everything. The notion of the universal library was already dead in the 19th century. Imagine today. Library of Congress does not collect every book that is published, contrary to the mission statement that you'll find on their webpage. If they collected every book that was ever published, they would have to have warehouse upon warehouse upon warehouse of dead storage that would be unusable. Choices have to be made. How do you make choices? How do you make those choices actually matter, make them usable to people? Those are the kinds of questions on the deep storage side that are being faced. But now with the added challenge of how do we store digital information? Digital information is incredibly fragile, incredibly dependent upon infrastructures that are themselves have costs, They raise all kinds of other questions. Digital files rot. They're so-called bit rot. The mere fact that you have many copies of something does not mean that they will be readable copies. You need an electrical grid, you need server grids, you need communication systems, you need people with the expert knowledge. Systems change, they're constantly being updated. This is a whole realm of challenges that go well beyond the traditional preservation and storage models that prevailed throughout the modern era.
It's so interesting to think about the infrastructure. Well, first of all, I want to get back to that word infrastructure, because at the end of the day, really that might be the lens through which, and this is the idea store is perhaps riffing on the idea of knowledge as infrastructure that needs to be ubiquitous, and therefore it doesn't need to be in a separate place. Indeed, in fact, that might be precisely the wrong way to deal with information if you're trying to make it accessible. But if you think about the infrastructure that we built, let's say as a nation, built to store all those books just between, I'm going to say, let's say 1850 and 2000. For those of you who are not architects, the weight of books is so unbelievably great that it's like you're building a nuclear reactor in part of the building that is to be the library. Whether it's Widener Library at Harvard, which has a whole separate structure and floor-to-floor height system designed for being able to have a ceiling no higher than you can reach a book, and it's made of a giant steel cage, as I recall, or iron maybe?
Yeah, the system that Widener uses, which is a system that you find in a very significant number of the research libraries throughout the United States, including, actually it was pioneered at the Library of Congress, the so-called SNEED stack system. That stack system is actually the support of the building. I mean, so your analogy with the nuclear reactor is very well founded. In other words, you could take the walls down.
Wow.
The stacks would support the ceiling.
Wow, wow. Well, it's because they have to carry so much more weight than even a building with a lot of traffic would otherwise carry.
Absolutely.
But all that expenditure was to the end of the storage issue. And now, one thing on which I at least you raised an eyebrow with me was the what did you call it? The duplication of formats. And because there's a part of me that imagines that, oh, well, gosh, it's only because we're still in the transition phase that we're still printing all those books. And I'm thinking about actually in my own professional life, we're getting more and more stuff on the iPad and more stuff that way. And I hope that one day, well, it'll be after he's out of high school, but my son will no longer be burdened, or future generations will no longer be burdened with the 800-pound backpack filled with $250 textbooks. But it does seem that as fragile as the digital storage thing is and as impermanent as it is, on the other hand, it is so much better in this storage and delivery that we're going to find a way to constantly update the systems and back them up, don't you think?
I'm agnostic on the subject, because I think that just the sheer volume of records that are being produced in digital form, that we are producing. It isn't just institutions that are producing that.
They're being produced right now in this room.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. And it's not that all of them have historical importance, but it suffices to know that in a single day, the number of photographs that all of us are taking is greater than the entire number of photographs that have been taken in the whole history of photography. Right. Okay? So that just gives you the beginning of the sense of the scale that we're talking about. So what does that entail? Well, it seems to me it entails, obviously, an urgent need to make decisions about what you decide to save or preserve and what you don't. Right. And that's actually an area where the library sort of the archival models, the kind of collecting models that we have inherited from the 19th century are completely hopeless. They still are largely built around some fictions or dreams of universal preservation of some kind or another. So that's a big challenge just in and of itself. But also, what does preservation mean? That's another fundamental question. I've been involved in a project that goes back to my Stanford years that the Library of Congress is running called Preserving Virtual Worlds. So some of you may remember there was a moment when there was a lot of excitement around environments like Second Life and other kinds of virtual platforms that people were increasingly experimenting with forms of sociability that were 3D environments for interacting, building content, and so forth. So what does it mean to preserve a virtual world? Well, you cannot preserve a virtual world almost by definition, in the sense that you can shoot video inside, you can do screen captures, you can reconstruct aspects of what the content that people built, shared, etc. But it isn't like being able to re-enter that environment and do something there. It's just not there. And all it takes is for Linden Labs to go out of business tomorrow, which may well happen. I don't know. I wish
they're the people who do that.
Yeah, they built Second Life. Virtual worlds end. Somebody pulls the plug. That is it. And I think this is true for many, many of the environments within which we produce meaning as communities. And so I think it's a very complicated problem. I think certain forms of knowledge, as was already the case with print, are easy to preserve and will be preserved, and solutions can be found. The sort of deep cave, dark cave solutions are being created. But I do think there is an inherent volatility to digital data that only the proliferation of copies is really a bulwark against. And print has its own challenges. So each media regime, each sort of model of how knowledge is disseminated and preserved bears challenges. So it's not that I don't think that there are good solutions to those challenges, but I think we're still very early in that conversation, and I do, as I try to suggest, I think the question of how print-based culture might be reimagined and reinvented in relation to these kinds of challenges is really an interesting question. This is a little bit of an outlier view. A lot of people in the sort of digital humanities community are all digital all the time. I think that print has not spoken its last word.
Well, this is great, and folks, if any of you are interested in asking some questions, I'm going to open it up here in just a minute, so I want to give you a little heads up about that. But there's one more important topic that I think this whole business about rethinking libraries raises in the digital age, in this moment when each one of us is creating so much digital content. I mean, it is just, when you zoom out for a second, it's just stunning. Even if you're not meaning to, the 10 pictures, the Facebook posts, the emails, and suddenly, wow, I produced a ton of stuff today. I guess that's what I was doing on my laptop. And well, with that comes maybe the argument for why, in your view, books might or print might somehow make a comeback. I don't know if it'd be print, but some kind of return of curatorship. Obviously, one of your sites is very interested in this. It seems to me inevitable. When you think about the liberating freedom that we have all, we're in this foamy ocean of freedom filled with nothing but stuff. And then at some point, we have to ask ourselves, okay, now which of this giant foamy ocean is worth reading? I can only read 7,000 things a day. Which ones should I read? And, whether it's newspapers, we now suddenly maybe realize with all these aggregator sites that we actually kind of liked having somebody tell us what, in the opinion of some experts, was the most important foreign policy story of the day. Which of these 19 NFL games was the one I really should be paying attention to, and so forth. I wonder if you see a rise of curated stuff. There's a rising demand for that, because maybe that's what libraries do.
Well, yeah, and I think that has been one of the core missions of libraries from the very beginning. Not all stuff was ever preserved. Once it was governments and princes who determined what gets preserved and collected. Sometime in the 19th century, or actually it started in the 18th century, there was this dream that we could collect everything, that we had democratized the nature of the knowledge we collected, and it would infinitely, that everything could be captured in some sense. And the great national libraries of Japan, France, throughout the world, the Library of Congress, all shared that as a founding dream. That was already a fiction in the 19th century. People were already way beyond their capabilities in terms of, and today, of course, that's just exponentially the case. And so, you know, whether as individuals or as institutions, we're very good at collecting stuff, at accumulating stuff, but we're very bad at knowing what to do with it. And unless you know what to do with it, it doesn't matter. It could disappear. It could vanish. So this question of how do we create tools? How do we create institutions? How do we build spaces that actually help us to accomplish that task of creating meaning out of this just sheer vertiginous accumulation of stuff? I mean, that's what I'm very interested in. And I think in the digital realm, you know, it's easy to get caught up in the hype of the kind of technology conversation. And it's a kind of rolling hype that just, you know, amplifies. But you know, we're really at the beginning of these social transformations. And I think there's some really interesting tools already that are emerging to allow people to curate your own data sort of production, the data fields that accompany you like a halo through life, and to make those halos meaningful or accessible or navigable or usable in some basic way. And I think that the same sorts of endeavors are going on with all of our basic institutions that are involved in knowledge and information. You know, and universities are right at the core of this issue. I think you know, I think the sort of conversation around massive online courses raises these issues with a vengeance. But certainly libraries crystallize this problem, I think, in a way that has a deep history, maybe a deeper history than the story of how we as individuals have created data trails around us, you know, going back to, you know, early in the modern era.
Well, this is one more bit about curatorship, though, because you were talking about how we're at the beginning of a transformation where we might very well be able to better curate all of this digital stuff around us. I think in some ways I was looking at the other side of that coin, which is in the past perhaps one of the things that libraries did, certainly local libraries that didn't aspire to a omnipotence that they could probably never achieve, was curating. Whether it was, you know, almost the Book of the Month Club rack, or whether it was, you know, that this is the important information. This is the core information you need to know. Whether it's the Encyclopedia Britannica, whether, you know, that there was, and you know, this, you know, the whole Wikipedia phenomenon is a different conversation, but an interesting one in this vein about trying to balance the desire to become ever more individually empowered with the need to have some level of collective agreement on, you know, that red is red, and that £5 means £5 at least, and stuff like this. And it seems like libraries maybe, or some kind of information management, information curation might be the thing to do this.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, libraries have always been curated spaces. Even at the peak of the dream of universal libraries, the reality is that libraries have always been making decisions about what is valid information, significant information, potentially historically important information. And that selective process is, in my view, even more needed today than it ever was in past centuries. So the argument among some of the sort of techno enthusiasts out there, you'll see on the list of institutions slated for extinction libraries, or professions, librarians. I think the contrary is true. That expert knowledge, the ability to parse these vast, quantities of data, the ability to establish authoritative information versus less authoritative information is a fundamental role. And I do think it's a role that nonetheless needs to be reinterpreted. And that's where we get into the interesting design conversation. So how do we build a space where the kind of distinctive challenges of curating information that has these multi-channel lives? That's what I think the library conversation today largely should focus on. And I do think that this issue of curation is really at the core of that design conversation. Absolutely.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to questions from you guys. Anybody have questions for our guest? They're busy being anxious about later today.
With the 5 o'clock deadline.
So I want to say something to you all before we go very quickly. But in the meantime, Jeffrey, I want to thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.